But now here's an economic fact. I was struck reading the financial press this morning by two stories that I think bear on what we're discussing. The first is the report that in the last quarter year, if I have the numbers right, may have been in the last 2 months, Chinese exports have soared. They have achieved a sudden spurt of exports at a time when the United States is hampering them with tariffs, is hampering everybody else with tariffs. What is going on? And the minute you disaggregate the numbers, you see right away their exports to the United States have gone down. But their exports everywhere else have gone up more than American exports to America have gone down. And that is a very important fact. Because if the rest of Asia understands what I just said, and they're looking at the same numbers I am, then there's the path. How do you get out of the damage the American threats entail? Is that you find export markets elsewhere, which is what the Chinese have done. And since a good number of their exports are to other Asian countries, they are incentivizing those countries to begin to work very hard, leading a number of observers to infer that what we're going to see is a bizarre outcome, a deflation in the global south. That as all of this supply that used to go to the United States doesn't, and all of it goes to the rest of the world, you're going to have, at least in the short run, an excess supply and no particular change in demand that we would look at, and therefore a deflationary impulse. And I'd like to talk about it for a moment, because tariffs, and this was the second story that caught my attention, both Bloomberg and the New York Times this morning carry articles about tariffs showing up in rising prices across the American consumer landscape. All right, now let me put these two together. Inflation in the U.S., deflation everywhere else. This is very bad for the American future. How are you going to ever persuade people to move production from elsewhere in the world to the United States when the United States is an inflationary core of a deflationary world economy? That's not a recipe that would make any CEO I know move to the United States. It would make them consider seriously not doing that if they had had a plan to do it. So yes, they will say to Mr. Trump, we planned $400 billion of investment in the United States. Very nice. You planned. And it's going to be over 4 to 10 years. A carefully chosen number because it's after Mr. Trump, to whom the promise was made, is no longer the president. But we are watching adjustments in the world that allow me no longer to have to say, it likely will be that, because what we were saying, it likely will be that, is now happening. The combination of recessionary indicators, that's what all that kerfuffle was last week about the employment numbers. You know, they got adjusted downward for 2 months and were very bad for the latest month. And Mr. Trump's dramatic firing of the poor woman who had the bad luck to issue the statistics. But those are signs of recession. And the stories in today's press are signs of inflation. That gets you the stagflation. If the United States can get its way by imposing tariffs on the world now, what will prevent it, as its problems deepen, from doing more of it? It's the old problem. If you do it, if you accommodate these tariffs now, if you really do what you have told Mr. Trump you will do, you are telling every American politician who comes after Mr. Trump, here's the way to solve your problems. Blame the rest of the world. Punish the rest of the world by imposing payments to yourself from the rest of the world. And you don't have to worry about how the rest of the world will respond, because you're the big empire who doesn't care. They all have to worry about the big U.S. The big U.S. doesn't have to worry about them. The fundamental flaw here is the United States represents 4.5% of the population of this planet. The other 95% and a half are not Americans. And you cannot get around that fact no matter what you do. And that means a policy in which you, a mouse, is assaulting the elephant will get you squashed. Well, no, it seems to me it is a strategy. You can try to get people to do what you want by offering an incentive that is positive, or you can get them to do what you want by threatening to do something that is negative. And Mr. Trump, I think it's fair to say, having tried or seen his predecessors try to do things in a different way, has decided that the way to do this is to bully or to threaten or do whatever you want to call what he's been doing for the last 6 months, a trade war, reciprocal tariffs, higher tariffs, a wildly higher tariff, sanctions, more sanctions. These are all what you might call negative incentives. As you put it, involve either a punch in the nose or the threat of a punch in the nose unless you behave. And I don't think this is going to work much better than the other one didn't seem to work. I infer from such pieces of information that there is something more fundamental going on that is simply not amenable to either the positive or the negative strategic moves. India has very big issues to solve, both internally, because it has many problems, and externally. And it is busy trying to do that in a way that, conforms to Mr. Modi's politics and so on. I don't think the United States' role in that is big enough to make a large difference. And the United States can't handle that fact. That is very troubling. It wants to believe that its very hints of something could lead a Japanese car maker to take drastic action that they already regret. But they did it. And so there's a basis for the American strategists to think they can do more of this because they can't face the underlying problem. Again, I don't mean to beat the horse, but it has to be said in a country that keeps denying it, that the empire is over. It cannot do what it once did. And it finds it unspeakably outrageous that that is the case. So it either behaves as if it weren't the case, very childish, but understandable, or it overreaches, very typical of empires in decline, or it actually tries to threaten and then is surprised to discover it doesn't work. You can see Mr. Trump, unable to get Lula to do what he wants, decides he's going to bring Mr. Bolsonaro back into the political life of Brazil, violating every conceivable notion of appropriate diplomatic behavior. It's just, these are signs to me of desperation. Every advertiser, all these countries around the world, has a new theme around which to construct their advertising. If they have been hired by a local producer of fill in the blank, whatever it is, washing machines, doesn't matter. They now have a new theme. Buy the domestic washing machine, my fellow citizen. Otherwise, you're doing the bidding of Donald Trump, whose name is now not positive in every one of these countries. They all feel attacked by him, which basically they have been. They all feel damaged or threatened with damage, and they want to know, what can I do? Every advertiser has figured this out already. I got something you can do. Buy the product that I'm the advertiser for. That will be your way to frustrate Mr. Trump in response to all that he has done to upset or anger or frighten you. This is going to be a staggering example of what is dryly put in the textbooks as a non-tariff protection measure. Very common. These countries will be swept, they already are, by anti-American views, feelings, ideas, true ones, untrue ones. All of it will be mushed together. But the net result will be that what Mr. Trump said in the clip, we've opened them up. He's going to discover, and now they're closing him down again. Not by act of government, which won't be necessary, but by act of the entire private profit sectors of the economy, in their industrial associations, in their contracts with advertisers. They are going to be doing what their business logic requires. If you lose one market, you go look for another one. You tell your advertiser, use what's important in the public mind, which isn't just tax and all the other modes of selling, but it's also foreign policy when it is as dominant a theme. And let me tell you, it was all over Canadian television. Day after day, what Mr. Carney said to Mr. Trump, what Mr. Trump said about or to Mr. Carney, and so on. That is the public mentality. And by the way, the numbers are already there. Canadian tourism in the United States is drastically down from what it used to be. Places in Florida and elsewhere that normally accommodate floods of Canadian tourists, because Canada's in the north and Florida is southern and warm, all of that's hurting the American business. If you wanted to know what the job creation was by what it did with autos, you have to balance that against what it did for tourism and what it did for in all the other ways. And now a final thought that has worried me. I keep explaining, as you know, that a declining empire is leading the United States to try to control the whole rest of the world, with the unwanted but quite logical result that it's really isolating the United States. Just like Mr. Trump does when he says, I'm going with fossil fuels to make my cars and trucks run, and the whole rest of the world is going with the electric cars and trucks, which do a better job for a lower price. And that in the end will cost Americans competitive jobs on a scale we can't even imagine. But now you have to ask the next question. What is it that makes Americans unable to see the self-isolating, self-destructive path they're on? And my answer is Gaza, because Israel is clearly, as almost everyone except Netanyahu and his circle can see, yes, it is blasting Lebanon, and it's blasting Gaza, and it's blasting the West Bank, but it is also isolating itself step by step, and yet it is moving. Nothing is too much. It's a terrifying image, but it might help us explain why the same group of people in this country who must deny the decline of the empire here cannot see the dead end of what the Israelis, that part of Israel, is doing, not just, of course, to that part, but to the entire project of Israel and, dare I say it, to the entire position of Jews around the world who are going to be held accountable for what is going on there, even if they were among its fiercest critics. But you're watching a kind of parallel, self-isolating, self-destructive behavior beyond all rationality. Denial is usually the forerunner of even more psychologically perverse attempts to live in the world. We are caught up in that, and we can only hope and speak out, of course, to try to get a recognition before it's literally too late. The United States went to war in Vietnam 30, 40 years ago, or longer, 50 years ago. Our enemy there was the Communist Party of Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. The United States lost the war. The United States is a big, powerful, rich country. Vietnam, let alone North Vietnam, is the opposite. Poor, been poor a long time, very limited military resources, and on and on and on. And the United States lost. Who runs Vietnam today? It's the Communist Party, the same party that was the adversary in that war. Who runs Afghanistan today? The Taliban. Who was the enemy of the United States in that war? The Taliban. Who left Afghanistan? The United States. What did the United States do in Afghanistan? Fight a war which it lost. It went to war in Iraq. I don't know exactly what they thought their goals were, but they didn't achieve them. And they're now losing in Ukraine, which has been a war between Russia on the one hand, and then Ukraine / the US on the other. These are signs of a serious problem for an empire, because it has fought several wars with countries much smaller, much poorer, much less militarily organized, and lost over and over again. That's a sign of an empire in trouble. But it's the least of it. Here's another one. In economics, we have a measure. It's a very crude measure, but it's a measure of the size of an economy. It's called the GDP, Gross Domestic Product. Many people know about it, and we measure it for all countries in the world. Each year we have a number that tells us what is the rough size. It's just adding up the total output of goods and services in one calendar year in a country. The GDP of the United States and its major ally, known as the G7, that's the United States, Japan, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. If you add those all up, it's 7 countries, and they have together about 28% of the global GDP, the total output of goods and services of all countries on this planet. Now, for most of the last 75 years, this was the center of the global economy. The G7 accounted for a wildly disproportionate amount, and they still do, although not what they once did, of exports, imports, capital movements, foreign investment, whatever, all of it. And the US dollar was the currency that they presided over. Okay, right now, I did the same calculation for the People's Republic of China. And I asked, what is the GDP there? And what is the GDP of the alliance that they've built called the BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus another 10 or 15 countries that have joined the BRICS since the original 5. Okay, what is it today? If the G7 is 28% of global GDP, what is China and the BRICS? Answer, 35% of global GDP. In other words, and for the first time since the Second World War, we have a new world economy in which there are 2 big economic power blocks. Not 1, 2. The one that used to be dominant is now number 2, not even close to number 1. 28 and 35 are far apart, and the gap is growing. That is, every year, including right now, including 2024, the rate of growth of the China BRICS is significantly higher, double or triple what it is in the West. I'll give you, if you want the numbers, I have them all in my head. I work with this stuff every day. I can tell you. In other words, the gap is actually growing worse to the favor of China, to the disfavor of the G7. This is a total transformation. I'll give you a couple of ideas of what it means. Now, when any country in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or increasingly now in Europe too, when there's a need for a railroad to be built somewhere, or a port to be built or expanded somewhere, or a proper medical system to be established, where do the representatives, public or private or partnerships, where do they go? Do they go to Washington and London the way they always did? Yes, they do. But when they're finished, they don't go home. They get on an airplane and they go to Beijing or New Delhi or Sao Paulo, and they ask for the same support, an export market, an import, capital investment, whatever. They ask the Chinese and their allies. Here's what we got in London and New York. Can you do better? We don't favor either of you, but we have to do this at the best terms we can get. And the Chinese are now richer and they give them better terms. That's why if you look at the railroads being built in Africa, they're mostly being built by Chinese. If you look at the big ports emerging in Latin America, they're all Chinese. There's no mystery here. But to not see what it means, you got to be crazy. You have to have a level of denial that is stupefying. If you add up the population of China and the BRICS, it's between 50 and 60% of the people on this planet. The United States has 4.5% of the people on this planet, and the G7 has under 20%. There's no comparison. And now that China has shown us that it can match high-tech development on a par with that of the United States, which they have done. Every great high-tech company here, Apple, Amazon, Intel, you name it, has an analog, has an equivalent in China. And And in a number of cases, the Chinese now are already ahead of the Americans. Electric vehicles, no contest. The Chinese won that. Solar panels to convert the sun into electricity, the Chinese, and we're not going to catch up because they keep making advance. The best battery for an electric car has been produced by the BYD Corporation, a Chinese car company that can now recharge your car in 5 minutes. It takes less time to recharge the electric car than it takes to put gasoline in your car the way we have always done, and changes everything. So the problem in the United States is that when I go through, and I could keep going if you want, this morning's headline, either in Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, gives you another way of understanding it. A survey has been done, and it shows that the number of young men, not women, men going to college after they finish high school is dropping dramatically. Why? It's too expensive. The atmosphere in the country is that it's not important. Universities are not important. Okay, this is as if when I read that, I'm watching slow motion self-destruction. This is capitalism, US capitalism, self-destructing. I teach, because I still teach in American universities, I teach, like all my colleagues, left-wing, right-wing, we all teach that the future of the world economy is going to favor people with a lot of education, who have technological skills, computer skills. The more menial tasks are going to be done by artificial intelligence, robots, and all. What are we doing? The Chinese keep adding to colleges and universities. We are closing them in the United States. This is crazy. More and more American students are going to Europe because they can get a college degree without paying and going into deep debt, which is what you have to do now here. This is not industrial policy. This is the opposite of industrial policy. We are undermining. And by the way, by not having young men go to college, you know what that does to the decision making of employers around the world? Move your production here? No. You won't have the pool of educated labor you need. You're not going to come here. It's just you're watching desperate activity, trying to hold on and finding it more and more difficult. And the last thing that might interest your audience, as more and more Americans are falling out of the global economy because the United States is not anymore a balanced economy. What we have in this country is we have the financial center, that's New York, and the high-tech center, that's in California and Massachusetts. Those are successful money-making machines. But you know what that means for the rest of the country? That they are back. They are junior partners of New York, Massachusetts, and California. And they have little enclaves, but the mass of people in the cities, in the suburbs, and in the rural areas are in more and more difficulty. And so what they did in recent years was move sharply to the right politically, as you see in Europe too. That's why we have Trump. That's why you have, for example, the American government has designated China as its big problem for almost 20 years now. That began under Obama, if not sooner, if not even earlier than that. It's not working. It's another example. The Chinese keep growing. Look, according to the IMF, in 2024, the fastest growing country among the G7 was the United States, which grew GDP 2.8%. All the rest of the G7 grew slower, less than that, and Germany went into a recession. And Germany used to be the engine of Europe and all of that. The Wirtschaftswunder of the last 75 years. What did the IMF say China's growth was in 2024? 5%. What was India's growth? 7%. Okay, this is 2 and 3 times what the best of the West could do, the United States. And so you're not defeating the Chinese, you're losing. You're losing. And, when you're losing, you have to face it so you can minimize your losses at the very least and reverse the situation if you can. I don't see us doing that. I think here's the evidence I would point to if I had to. Literally over the last 3 or 4 days, the Chinese, Xi Jinping, their leader, has made it crystal clear. You keep putting tariffs on us, we won't go as far as you do. The Chinese very cleverly always wait and respond so that the blame for the whole whole process goes on the initiator, the United States. And then they're very careful to raise less than quite equivalent. That's theater, because at these levels it's immaterial. And the Chinese are busily organizing how to avoid any trade with the United States. And now here comes the alliance with the BRICS. They have an ongoing alliance with 55 to 60% of the people of the world. That's their resource to try to find alternative markets, to try to find alternative sources. Lest anyone be under a mistake, let me remind you about something having to do with the Ukraine war. When it begins in February of 2022, the president then of the United States, Joseph Biden, the Secretary of State, Blinken, and others, said that this was a war that would collapse the ruble, that would collapse the Russian economy, would see the end of Mr. Putin as a leader, and maybe even break Russia up into smaller countries. Unbelievable. None of that happened. Russia's growth in 2024 was faster than that of the United States. That's the IMF. Not my numbers, their numbers. Okay, so what exactly is it that's going on here? Well, the Russians turned to the BRICS. When Europe says when they blow up the Nord Stream pipeline there near you up there in the North Sea, and the Russians can no longer sell oil or gas en masse to the Germans and the rest of Europe, they went to the BRICS and they sold their oil and gas to India and China. I mean, I'm making it simpler than it is, but that's the basic story. They solved their problem. They made the sanctions fail. Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. The United States has hit them with sanctions. Europe has hit them with sanctions that don't work. They don't work. They are a failure. You have to at least admit it, which they don't, because they keep talking about more sanctions. So they have to understand it doesn't work, and they have to ask why not. And the answer is the BRICS. Well, then if you have tariffs against China, of course what the Chinese are going to do is look at exactly what saved the Russians. And indeed, one of the things the Chinese are doing is making loans to Russia to enable Russia to buy what the Chinese can't sell in the United States. It is so, if you pardon me, obvious that the really interesting question isn't about the strategy, but the blindness of the West, of the United States, and even more of the French and the British and the Germans. Are you seriously, your reaction to this, and I don't mean to blame you, obviously, or for that matter, Norway, which is not responsible for this, but when I read in the newspaper that Friedrich Merz is going to borrow money in the name of Europe to build a German military with $800 billion, I mean, are the rest of you in Europe going to allow finally that Germany will have the military? Because Germany will never be able to intimidate the United States and China, but it will be in a position, if it has that kind of military, to oppress you again. My God, perversions emerging from this blindness, this denial, should worry Europeans. It worries me. My mother was born in Germany. My mother is born in Berlin, and my father in France. I speak French and German since my childhood. I'm an American. I'm born here and work here and all that. But, half of me is still part of the European culture and all of that. And I'm very fearful. What I see is very depressing in terms of their desperation